Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Dorothy here from the CCMA. You're very welcome on this Friday morning, the 19th of February, to our talk on how is the pandemic impacting the world of work. And we're delighted to be joined by Pawel Adrjan, who is head of EMEA Research with Indeed. And a very distinguished speaker we have this morning, ladies and gentlemen. We really appreciate Pawel's time. Just before we came on, he was explaining that they've launched a new report this morning, Indeed. So he's been busy all morning on social, sharing the insights from that latest report, some of which we might get to talk about at some point, Pawel, in the half hour or so that we have. But what we're going to specifically talk about this morning is the trends in the job postings and what that's saying to us about the state of the market. What we can compare with, or what we can learn from comparing Ireland with what's happening in other countries. And the question everybody's asking is remote here to stay? And I think who better than Indeed to have insights that they can share with us on where they see the jobs market going and what trends they are seeing at the moment. So as always, thanks to Neva's there, who's helping in the background. We are recording the webinar. Pawel will share a copy of his presentation after today's event, but we really do encourage you to engage as much as possible. This is the opportunity to ask Pawel any questions that you have in terms of your own organization and what you're seeing in the recruitment space. And we're also conscious that many member companies are seeing their volume of activity fall. So we're also conscious of, for companies that are experiencing spikes and increased demand, there are also member companies who are experiencing a decline. So I'm going to hand over to Pawel. As always, any questions you have, put in the chat box there to the side. We'd be delighted to answer any questions or share any observations that you have or your own experiences. And I know that midway through, Pawel has a poll as well that we'll ask some questions. So Pawel, thanks again. Really looking forward to this, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dorothy. It's a real pleasure to be here. Excuse me, speaking to CCMA members and other attendees of the webinar. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you also to Barry O'Toole, who is a senior director at Indeed and a board member at the CCMA. I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. Dorothy, can you see the slides?
See it perfectly.
Perfect. Thanks again. I'll kick off. I am the head of EMEA Research at Indeed, the world's biggest job site, and the research fellow in economics at Regent's Park College in Oxford. And in today's presentation, I'd like to talk about the changes that the pandemic has prompted in the world of work. Throughout most of the presentation, what I will draw on is actually data from Indeed. For those of you who aren't familiar with what Indeed looks like, this is a screenshot of the Indeed site. So as I said, Indeed is the world's largest job site. It's a very simple search engine for job seekers where people can go in and essentially type in what job they're looking for and where they are looking for jobs. And as you can see here, in this example, I actually left the what search box blank because the most common search that people carry out on Indeed is actually a blank search where people only put in a location and they're interested in seeing all the jobs in that location. So actually this already brings up one question for employers and for recruiters, which is how do you get your jobs in front of those job seekers who are searching very broadly for any kind of job in a given place. And for the location, I actually mentioned Kilkenny here because it's an important place for economists like myself. It's got nothing to do with hurling, but instead with an annual weekend of economics and comedy, which takes place in Kilkenny called Kilkenomics. It's an event that has been happening for over 10 years now, something that I really enjoyed before the pandemic and something that really put Kilkenny on the map for the economist community. But onto the actual content of the presentation, what I will do today is I will talk about three things. First, I'll talk about the latest trends in job postings on Indeed and try to extrapolate from those trends into some takeaways about the overall state of the labour market in Ireland. Number two, I'll talk about what we can learn from comparing trends in Ireland with trends in other countries. Because Indeed is a global job site, we actually have similar data for other major economies in the world. And so we can look at what jobs employers are posting, what the trends in job posting volumes are, and how job seekers are behaving in those other countries. And that can give us a few insights into what's going on in Ireland as well. And finally, I'll talk about one of the major changes in the world of work that's happened over the last year, which is the huge shift towards remote work. And I'll ask whether remote work is here to stay. And I'll try to shed some light on those trends, also using Indeed's data. So first of all, just to give you the big picture context of what we see going on in the Irish labour market, this chart shows the overall trend in job postings on Indeed since the 1st of February 2020, so since just over a year ago, adjusted for seasonality. And what we see is that obviously when the pandemic hit, there was a huge decrease in job posting volume, so a huge decrease in hiring activity. But over the last 7 months or so, that has gradually picked up. And what we see is that on the positive side, job postings have been growing despite kind of the up and down swings in social distancing restrictions and despite the recent return to the full lockdown. On the negative side, total job posting volume is still around 24% lower than where it was before the pandemic. So that is kind of a barometer of the overall health of the jobs market in Ireland. Clearly, employers aren't hiring as much as they used to overall before the pandemic. Now, that is a trend that we're seeing in pretty much every developed economy around the world. And you can see on this chart, which is a comparison of the trends in Ireland with the trends in the biggest European economies, that pretty much all countries followed a similar pattern. So a big hit to hiring activity at the beginning of the pandemic, and a slow, gradual recovery since then. Ireland is kind of in the middle of the pack. So it was one of the most heavily impacted economies in terms of job postings at the onset of the pandemic, but has kind of recovered at a fairly brisk pace, certainly slightly faster than Spain and the UK. And it's kind of in the middle of the pack now. This trend, I think, shows that the recovery of the labor market is slow and will probably be slow for the foreseeable future across Europe. But it's something that we will be monitoring very, very closely, especially as the vaccines are rolled out across the world. Now, one interesting thing is that for the time being, we don't really see any impact of the vaccination rollout on economic activity more broadly, or on hiring and job posting activity more specifically. And even if we look at places like Israel that have really been leading among the world's developed economies in terms of the vaccination drive, we're still not seeing a big pickup there. Similarly, in the UK, which is certainly a leader in Europe in terms of vaccination, at least on the basis of the first dose, we're also not seeing the UK really showing much pickup in terms of hiring activity. And I think the main reason for that is that even countries that are vaccinating are still under quite severe lockdowns. So, for instance, Israel has only just started to relax some of the restrictions while the vaccination drive continues. So this is something that we will be watching very closely as a kind of leading indicator, perhaps, of economic activity and hiring activity going forward. Now, those were trends for the Irish economy and other economies as a whole. But this crisis has a very peculiar nature, which is that it's a very uniquely sectoral crisis. As we all know, businesses in certain sectors really haven't been able to operate as normal over the past year, whereas others have actually been very, very active and have actually been hiring people to help with managing customer demand. So what we see here is that if we look at Ireland specifically, and if we look at job postings by sector, there is quite a wide difference in terms of how different sectors are performing in terms of hiring. So at the top, we see healthcare leading the way, which is perhaps not very surprising, given that in a pandemic, there is a pretty solid demand for healthcare personnel. But we also see some other sectors performing quite well and much better than the overall Irish average of minus 24. And those are areas like production and manufacturing, installation, maintenance, and repair, as well as some other white-collar type jobs in tech, social science, and engineering. On the other hand, we see that food and beverage is at the very bottom, still down 62%, so almost triple the overall Irish average. Again, not very surprising because of ongoing lockdowns. And maybe what's interesting for CCMA and its members is that customer and personal service roles are still also down quite significantly in terms of demand for workers. Now, within that broad customer and personal service sector, roles related specifically to customer service representatives and customer support representatives are down about a third, so slightly better than what this might indicate, but still quite far below some of these healthcare, production, and tech type roles. So I think the main takeaway is that it's a very unequal recovery, and it's something that we see not only in Ireland, but really all over the world, where very similar types of jobs are negatively impacted everywhere because of the nature of the pandemic and the restrictions. And conversely, we see that quite a few of the tech and professional manufacturing healthcare roles are doing well all over the world.
Pawel, I know you're going to do the poll. I'm not sure if you're going to do it in the next minute or two, but just a question that has come in from Jeff. I'd like your opinion on the opportunity, it's a very specific question now, on the opportunity for independent contractors, consultants hired on contracts in the Irish market in general, Dublin in particular. So it's a very specific question, I know, from Jeff.
Thanks for the question. So we haven't looked specifically at contract roles, but the trends that I'm showing here are broadly for sectors and occupations. And I think that as always in areas where hiring is picking up, there are opportunities both for employees and for contractors to get work, because the fundamental drivers of these sectoral trends are ultimately demand from the final customers in those sectors. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that's how I would read this table from a sort of self-employed or contractor perspective.
Yeah, Jeff has said thanks, so I think he's happy. Thanks, Pawel.
So yes, so in a nutshell, these are the trends that we're seeing on the demand side, and as I said, my read of these trends is that the recovery is gradual and will probably remain quite gradual and slow for the foreseeable future. But I'd like to also hear from you to see what you think about the pace of the recovery in the area of hiring. And so the question that we'd like you to answer is, when do you expect hiring levels at your company to return to their pre-pandemic level? So has it already happened? Is it likely to happen this quarter, next quarter? in the second half of the year, or perhaps not at all this year. Maybe you expect that to happen in 2022 or later.
Great,
So
those answers.
we'll give you a few minutes.
We might just give people about 10 more seconds.
Okay, so some very interesting results. Looks like the most common answer was the second half of 2021. So perhaps in line with what I was suggesting, that the recovery would be quite slow. But there's a wide range of answers here, with 10% saying that the hiring levels have already gone back to their pre-pandemic levels. 5% are saying they expect this to happen this quarter, another 5% next quarter, and overall, around 80% of the answers are that this will happen in the second half of this year or next year. So quite a pessimistic view, but also quite a wide range of responses. I have to say that when I asked this question to different groups at different events, I do get a very different split of answers. And I do suspect that this depends to a large extent on the sectors that are represented. So that's perhaps something we can discuss at the end. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the demand side. But of course, the labor market consists of both the demand side, the employers, but also the supply side, the job seekers. And one thing that we can deduce so far from this data is that there have been some major shifts on the demand side, major shifts in terms of the employers and the types of jobs that are on offer in the market today. But of course, the question is also what's happening on the supply side. So are job seekers adapting to these shifts in demand? Is everybody from the food and beverage sector now applying to jobs in driving or maintenance or manufacturing? Well, what we find actually is that to some extent this is happening, and to some extent job seekers are searching more outside of their occupation if their job has been affected or if their sector has been affected. But we don't see that adjustment happening fully because, of course, there are certain barriers to switching sectors. There are qualifications that may be needed or some experience requirements. And so one thing that we've done is we've looked at the number of clicks that each job posting on Indeed in Ireland gets. And we've looked at how that number of clicks per job posting has changed over the past year in different occupations. And what we find is that there are some divergent trends. And that basically the shift in job seeker behavior and job seeker clicks hasn't matched exactly the shift in job postings. So on the one hand, we've got some areas where we've actually seen a very high rate of growth in clicks per posting, and those are the ones that you see on the left-hand side of this chart: driving, banking and finance, customer service, information design, and administrative assistance. And those, that's an interesting mix because I think what we see in most countries is that generally the areas that are seeing a growth in clicks per posting are those areas that are relatively easy for job seekers to enter. So in other words, for something like nursing or tech, where you need to get lots and lots of qualifications if you don't already have them, we don't really see big increases in clicks because it's hard for job seekers to actually switch into those sectors. But in areas like driving, customer service, or admin assistance, we do see that across the board, and that does seem to be a pattern also in Ireland. So In terms of employers who are hiring for customer service jobs, for instance, which is a big part of the audience, clicks per posting have risen, and that's essentially good news for those employers who are still hiring for those kinds of roles. On the other hand, we see that a lot of the areas that have experienced the biggest increases in demand for workers from employers, like care, loading and stocking, manufacturing, or cleaning, actually, we haven't seen such a big increase in clicks per posting as we might expect. And on the one hand, from an economic perspective, that's actually bad news, because we'd want candidates to really recognize where the job opportunities are today and be able to shift towards those sectors. Again, especially if they don't require lots of new qualifications or higher qualifications than those that people already have. But it looks like in some of those areas, which are actually quite essential in a health crisis, job seeker interest really hasn't kept up with demand. So I guess one takeaway for employers that are hiring for those kinds of jobs is to really think about how to attract job seekers to those kinds of jobs, and to really understand why perhaps interest isn't as high as it could be. Is it because of pay? Is it because of working conditions? Or is it because of health risks related to dealing with customers, dealing with patients that need to be addressed? So that's kind of a high-level overview of supply and demand shifts based on what we see on Indeed. And I think it's clear from some of those trends and from everyone's personal experience that the pandemic has impacted the world of work in many ways. I think the good news is that as the economy recovers, and it will certainly recover at some point, a lot of these shifts will probably reverse. So at some point, hospitality sector will reopen, travel will restart, and business activity and hiring activity in those sectors will certainly come back to some kind of balance. But I think there are also some kinds of changes in the world of work that are unlikely to reverse completely. And I think that is still a major question for the future, which is which shifts are those and which shifts are likely to persist. I think one of those shifts is going to be the huge shift to remote work that we've been seeing. And I think that's not only a trend in itself, but also something that is likely to have a knock-on effect on other sectors of the economy, especially in large cities where a lot of people work from home. First of all, just to frame the huge extent of this work from home shift, this work from home experiment, we did some analysis with the central bank early last year, and we found that just over half of jobs in Ireland were in occupations with high work from home potential. So it's a huge potential shift in the labor market. In fact, data from the Central Statistics Office from last spring said that over 1/3 of those whose employment was affected by COVID had shifted to working from home. So a big shift that touches on the lives of many people. We see that change very clearly in terms of hiring activity as well, and in terms of job postings. What we find is that right now, approximately 14% of all job descriptions in Dublin and about 12% of all job descriptions outside Dublin explicitly talk about remote working. That is actually a very high level of mentions of remote work, especially if you consider that there's still a ton of jobs in areas where remote working isn't feasible. So in areas like healthcare, for instance, where we've seen job postings recover, to above their pre-pandemic level, and very little work can actually be done remotely. Those levels of remote work mentions in job postings in Ireland are actually quite similar to what we see in other major European countries. So when we compare Dublin to the largest capital cities in Europe, that 14% is more or less in line with Berlin and close to London and Madrid, and actually well above the level of Paris, where remote working hasn't caught on as much as it did elsewhere. I think one interesting thing from this chart, one interesting takeaway is that remote working in job postings is a lot more prevalent in the capital cities than outside them. The main reason for that is really the composition of jobs. Capital cities simply have more jobs in areas like tech, marketing, legal, where remote working is more feasible. Now, of course, some jobs simply cannot be performed remotely, and we can never expect them to shift. So if we break down job postings in Ireland by occupation, we can see that as many as 26% of postings for software developers mention remote work, while virtually no job postings in personal care and home health do. And that's simply related to the tasks that those jobs entail. But what I think is really interesting, kind of related to this shift in the world of work, is that some jobs which didn't really used to involve a lot of remote work have embraced that shift a lot more. So, for instance, in areas like software development, there always used to be a fairly high proportion of people working from home, at least occasionally, and those jobs have typically tended to mention remote work more as a perk in the past. So it's not that surprising that software development is also among the occupations with the highest proportion of remote work mentions today. But we do see some surprises in other areas, like, for instance, arts and entertainment, media and communications, architecture, engineering, which are jobs that didn't really used to talk about remote work much, and in reality didn't used to be performed remotely very much. And they have really embraced that shift, and we've seen a very big increase in remote working in those areas. So that suggests we are seeing a lot of businesses and a lot of people actually learning to perform those jobs remotely for the first time. And that, to me, does suggest that some of that will stick after the pandemic.
Pawel, can I just come in with a question from Mary, if that's okay?
Sure.
She has asked, is there a change in the number of job postings that mention blended work? So obviously some days from home and some days from the office.
Yeah, so that's a good question, which I think relates nicely into some of the takeaways that I'd like to talk about. But essentially, yes. So there are a lot of jobs which mention that hybrid, blended approach. So, for instance, a certain number of days that people can work from home with other days spent in the office. There are also some job postings that mention remote working is something that's only temporary due to COVID, and that they plan to go back to in-office work afterwards. So yeah, it's a mix of sort of permanently remote, fully remote work, and that hybrid mix. And I personally think that that hybrid mix is the model that will prevail after the pandemic. I think there are still a lot of economic benefits of getting people together in a place and having them work together. But at the same time, we're seeing from surveys that a lot of businesses and a lot of employees have learned how to work remotely well. They believe that there are productivity gains from working remotely as well. So I think in the end, it will be a balance of those things that will prevail. But I don't think that remote working will disappear completely. And one additional reason why I think remote working will prevail to some extent comes from the trends that we see actually over the past year. So one thing that we can observe if we look at the trend in remote postings on Indeed is that first of all, it has grown hugely. That means lots of new people have been exposed to this trend. But also, when we look at periods of easing of restrictions over the course of the past year, we never really see remote working going away, at least as captured by mentions in job postings. So what you see on this chart, for instance, is that last summer, when restrictions were eased, job postings mentioning remote work in Dublin actually kept on going, basically non-stop as a share of all postings. And even outside Dublin, where there's been a bigger shift towards job postings that cannot be done remotely in areas like hospitality and travel, that share of remote job postings never actually went away and fell to the pre-pandemic levels. So I think that's one indication of why this kind of hybrid model and remote work might persist. Another argument is that on the job seeker side, we also see that interest in remote working remains very high. So again, we saw the share of job searches containing keywords related to remote work increase when the pandemic first hit. And it eased slightly over the summer when other jobs became available, but it never quite fell away to the pre-pandemic levels, and actually has continued to rise through the most recent lockdowns. This actually matches what we hear in surveys, which is that many people who have tried working from home think that it's more productive. And many people in the most recent surveys say that they'd like to continue working from home for at least part of the time. And just to give you a sense of how Irish job seekers compare to job seekers in other major European economies, we're actually seeing Irish job seekers leading in terms of the share of searches containing keywords related to remote work, slightly ahead of the UK and Germany. I think actually there could be various reasons for differences across countries. So for instance, in France, remote work was never as popular as it was in Ireland before the pandemic, and it isn't as popular as it is in Ireland now. But one pattern that we see that is very clear is that this interest, one, does follow the timing of the tightening and easing of restrictions within each country very closely. And two, in none of the countries where we saw an increase did we ever see job seeker interest in remote work fall back to the pre-pandemic levels. So that's, I think, another good takeaway for employers, which is if you are offering jobs that can be done remotely, at least in part, make sure that that's clear to the job seekers and the candidates. So just to close, a few takeaways. One, I hope to have shown you that the labor market recovery is progressing, though it is quite slow. The good news is that it does vary by sector. So some sectors are experiencing a big pickup in activity. In some sectors, that growth in hiring means that there is greater competition for candidates because the supply of job seekers isn't necessarily keeping up with demand. While in other sectors, where it's a little bit easier to get into jobs, we're actually seeing applicant volumes rise and competition for candidates is lower. And the final takeaway I'd like to leave you with is that I think the shift towards remote work for the time being looks quite deep and persistent. And I think it's one of the shifts that will prevail after the pandemic. If you'd like to follow our research, you can do so at hiringlab.org. We have a dedicated site for the UK and Ireland. And I'll stop here and take any questions.
Pawel, that's great. Thank you so much. Very insightful. And it's really interesting to see the trend. And I think very much what you're saying in terms of remote working is here to stay. I mean, certainly that's what we're hearing from a lot of companies. A very simple question. You know, at the very beginning when you showed, you put in the location of Kilkenny. Now for remote working or for companies who are saying, well, you can be anywhere. So as a company who is posting jobs, if you are a company, so what do you do in that circumstances where location actually isn't an issue?
So what we find is that actually the vast majority of jobs that mention remote work do still specify a city location, which is where the company or the office is based. I think there are two reasons for that. One is that a large part of those jobs may be temporarily remote or may require people to go into the office eventually for part of the time. So I think that's one way to flag that the job does have a specific base, a specific location. And I think the other part of the story is that we still see talent largely based, in specific places. Talent isn't fully mobile, and when people search for remote jobs, they do often say, remote Dublin or remote London. They don't always just look for remote jobs anywhere. So,
Okay.
for instance, so I think those are the two main reasons actually why it's still important to think about location. And for jobs that are fully remote, that can be done fully from home, perhaps make sure that you use all the tools that are available online to target job seekers in locations other than where the company is based. So I think the one advantage to employers is that if you're hiring for a fully remote job, you actually have access to a much wider pool of candidates potentially in places where they actually may have fewer other opportunities.
Yeah, and I think certainly what's coming through from speaking to a lot of companies is the fact of, people in hospitality and retail that's now closed. They do have those customer service skills that can be transitioned over to customer service, contact center, customer experience roles, which is great. The talent is there for sure.
Yeah, and when we look at, we can look at people's CVs and we can look at what jobs they're clicking on Indeed, and we do find that people from the food and hospitality sectors have increased clicks on other occupations, and one of the target occupations that they are increasingly clicking on is customer service. So I think some job seekers do recognize that they do have those customer service skills. And that's probably one reason why we did see that in Ireland, customer service was one of the areas where we've seen an increase in clicks per posting relative to the average job.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it. I know you're such a busy man, and I know Barry's on the call. So thank you so much to Barry as well for facilitating and facilitating the introduction. So really appreciate your time again. We'll have a PDF version of the presentation available up on the website, hopefully on Monday, for anybody who wants to share it with colleagues. I think there's some very valuable insights that will be of interest to wider teams in many of the companies that were on the webinar this morning, and the recording will also be up on Monday. But Pawel, have a lovely weekend, and thank you again, and we'll hope to keep in touch with you throughout the year to see how the trends are developing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Thanks, Niamh. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.